Coffee at the back. Simon, you can help yourself to coffee since yesterday you brought me a coffee. That was very kind of you. So for many of you who don't know me, my name is David Hill. I'm with Canadian Sport Institute Pacific. I'm the lead for coaching and system development. I've been working very closely with VIA Sport in the excellence piece of the triangle. Just from our perspective, our staff that's here today, we've got Kurt, everybody knows Kurt, Director of Talent Development, James Goose, Athlete Services here in Vancouver, Sarah Kigersley. I should have just said Sarah. That was it. Sarah Kate. Athlete Coach Services here in Vancouver. Drew Todd from Victoria, and Amy Dearden, our manager of Coach Services from Victoria. Heather.
Cool. For anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Heather Beattie at VIA Sport. Welcome. Thanks for coming today. Just want to recognize two of our staff here in the room. They're both PVCs. We have Emma Rimmer and Yenna Kim. And also want to recognize that today is National Aboriginals Day. So happy National Aboriginals Day. And we're here today to talk about the Excellence Report. So that's Report 3 of the Investment Review series. We will be recording today's session for anybody who wants to watch it again later or pass it on to their colleagues or people that are not here. So that's why there's 2 cameras in the back.
A quick agenda for what we want to accomplish this morning. We're going to talk about the whole investment review process. Okay, so from where it started to where we are now. This will be a part of this report 3 that we're announcing today on the excellence funding. We will do a bit of a review of what does enhanced excellence look like in BC. Some of that will be more of a historical perspective of all the good things that we actually do here in BC, and I think that that's something that we should be very proud of as a provincial community. And also some of the elements that we learned out of the investment review that really helped us in some of the decisions that we were able to make for this report. We'll also look at the oversight of excellence within BC and the roles and responsibilities that different organizations will have. And then the last part, we'll get into the excellence funding. And that will really just outline, like, okay, what is the process for you as a PSO? Are you eligible? How do you get selected? How does the allocation work? Those types of things. And then at the end, we've added on a little bit more because we just want to delve into the deliverables. So some of you who are getting excellence funding right now will have gotten notification of a Schedule B. And what we want to look at specifically is what are your requirements as far as reporting on those deliverables. Okay, so Heather.
Yeah, so just to highlight again the key objectives from the investment review that were also applied to the enhanced excellence funding. So this is right from the BC Ministry Services Plan. Individuals have more opportunities to participate in sport in order to be more physically active, healthier, and achieve their personal goals. Athletes have more opportunities to achieve excellence in sport, to inspire greater participation in their home community, and major events support sport, economy, and community development. So based on these objectives from the ministry, VIA Sport and the ministry came up with our own objectives related to the investment review. And that was to investigate the impact and effectiveness of participation funding against stated program objectives, investigate the impact and effectiveness of performance funding against the program objectives, develop a standardized framework for funding, recognition and accreditation of organizations, and apply the Canadian Sport for Life principles. So there's a lot of words on this slide. No, I think it's still me. The outcomes of the investment review that we're looking to achieve were to consider the diversity of the organizations in BC, to ensure that a common standard is applied across all sports to have a fair and equitable program, to ensure that organizations are accountable for their funding, and to gather and report on data that enables the sports sector to demonstrate their ability to achieve those previous objectives. So most of you were part of the previous stages of the investment review where we looked at core funding, and we also did a review of the former IPS program, and that puts us where we are today with what's now called the Enhanced Excellence Funding Program.
Great. Just to add to that, I think these outcomes really speak to the complexity of what we're trying to do here within the province. Yes, we are all under the umbrella of sport, but it's almost like you have, each one of you is like a different car. And it's really hard to bring all those parts and systems together. Just trying to make this, Drew, you love the analogies, right? But I think when you look through this, I mean, that diversity is a reality here. Each one of the sports is unique. It has its own unique way of delivering programming. And then I think speaking of the last one, because we'll get into this a little bit later on, but just looking at how we can better collect data to tell the story about sport here in British Columbia.
What do you mean by data? Economic impact, results,
I wish
numbers?
if you could actually do that, Bruce, that would be great. If we could actually look at the economic impact of the high performance sports sector. So this is something that I know is done across, for instance, PBC Games would have economic numbers.
I think it's a rhetorical question. I mean, the question is, what kind of data do we need? And let's go out and get it.
Yeah.
As opposed, I mean, you just throw, we're going to collect data, tell them better. Do we have a strategy to do that?
Yeah, we do, and that's part of what we're looking at within the deliverables. Yeah.
So
I'm talking about an overall strategy with everybody in this room as opposed to just a one-off. And if it's economic impact, for every buck you kick in, the government gets X amount of economic impact as well as taxes coming back. And so basically they're making money in sport. How are we going to tell that story? What's the strategy?
That's great.
Huh?
Yeah, I don't have the answer to that question, but it is a rhetorical question.
Yeah.
Yes. Right? So let's hold on to that, and then maybe we can see later on. Yeah.
Well, I just, when you said that, that's a very important thing because we don't do it. As well as in these kind of meetings, I can't stand them unless we have some takeaways.
Yes.
And so let's just park that puppy and maybe we can move it later on.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. There's only 2 slides here.
I'll say no more. I'll say no more.
So many of you are familiar with these diagrams with the integrated performance system. And probably one of our shifts in talking to many of you as PSOs is, well, what's the new IPS look like? Well, I think we're maybe moving away, or let's just say we are moving away. Let's not call it the IPS anymore. We're going to call it Enhanced Excellence. Okay? That doesn't mean we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, in that many of the principles around the IPS were very good and well-founded principles. And the one Venn diagram on the left really talks about the sort of first iteration around the IPS groups. So we had targeted sports, targeted athletes, targeted game preparation. We had 3 levels of service, national, provincial, regional, and then 3 performance pathways. So there's athlete, coaches, and performance enhancement teams. And all of that was sort of intersected by a solid performance plan, integrating that all together. So many of you being architects of that program will be very familiar with that. It did evolve over time, and this was one of the ones I stole from one of Wendy Patton's presentations that she made. And really it's just this idea of bringing in the multi-games preparation as a big part of the provincial landscape, sectioning out the coach development, athlete development, and then keeping the sports science, sport medicine piece. once again, intersected by performance planning. And the big difference here is it's like the outside is this excellence and accountability. So bringing that in, that we are, one, about achieving excellence. So if we're talking high performance, there is an overall goal to achieve, let's just put it that way. And then the other one is, how can we be accountable to that achievement? You guys want another analogy? Help you remember this slide? It's kind of like a neuron. If you think of all those circles as like neurons, and then the outside is like the myelin sheath, it helps the neurons, like, you know, yeah, I'm gonna leave it there. A good system might mean that you've got it all in place. So this is just a slide of the evolution of the IPS, looking over the years. We had data back in 2007 to 2009. At that point, we did have a regional coach program through the Pacific Sport Centers. There was a change in 2012, 2014 to move that more into the PSOs. But basically, I mean, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. You can just see how things have progressed with regard to the total number of sports that have applied, the number of sports that were accepted to receive this funding. Okay.
So just one main thing to highlight, instead of having two programs targeted in the regional, we're now in one enhanced excellence funding program with more flexibility as to how you spend that money. And the total amount of funding here is not the total amount of funding invested into high performance in the province. It's just related to the enhanced excellence funding program, which is meant to augment the existing programming that you're already doing as PSOs. Just to highlight a few more changes that occurred in this past year, we looked at the reporting requirements and we tried to streamline that, and now all the reporting will be done through BCSI, and we have created some reporting templates which we'll show you at near the end of this presentation. We reviewed the objectives of IPS, and like we said, instead of just being the money just going into coaching, there is flexibility as to if you have already invested into coaching and you need to spend it on, say, sport science, the flexibility would be there. And the role of the athlete development advisors was reviewed and now streamlined more through Dave as a key contact, but contacting your PDC at VS Sport first, and then we'll liaise with Dave to make sure all your questions related to high performance get answered.
And just so you know, we'll be talking about those roles. So one of the challenges in the investment review, and there was a question in the excellence component around defining what high performance is. And we had a lot of PSOs, many of them came back and just had very informal conversations with me with regard to, well, what is a good definition for high performance in British Columbia? So we felt that it was important to try and land on a definition and being very careful in how we position that definition. So obviously one of the key elements is an LTAD pathway, and that goes back to some of the comments on the service plan and the objectives that VIA Sport is under, and also ourselves as the Institute. A notion that programming is athlete-centered and coach-led. An idea of optimal support, and this is an ISTAT Valley term because it's kind of like optimal. It can be a wide variety of things depending on what your context could be. A notion of conversion. What does conversion look like in your sport context? So are we actually progressing athletes through a pathway? With the measure of BC athletes on national teams, so national teams being important. And of course, where possible, because we recognize that not all sports within the sector are for Paralympic sport, but certainly a priority towards Olympic or Paralympic sport. How many of you have seen this slide? Oh, come on, some of you guys. Yes, absolutely. So this was a Wendy Patton napkin at one point that really became sort of a conceptual view of what a pathway could look like within the province of BC. As you can see across the bottom, it's really anchored in the Canadian Sport for Life stages. And where really high performance starts is train to train. And that would be different depending on each sport and how they've defined what those stages are within their sport-specific LTAD. So you can see that the road goes up and it sort of mimics the LTAD pathways. I thought that was kind of cool. And then you've got the sort of flags along the way, and those flags are really the competition opportunities that we have in sport. And you know, fortunately or unfortunately, the competition structure tends to drive a lot of the decision making that we have in sport. And now in some circumstances that may be a challenge, okay, sure. On others, that might be an opportunity. Many of you in your NSOs are going through some of those discussions right now. Just talking to Chris actually this morning, and there's discussions with Volleyball Canada around that competition structure. So while some of your sports may not have all of those milestones through the pathway, many of you will have them. On the outside of the pathway are institutions that would actually support, that may not necessarily be fully our responsibility. So things like BC school sports, or as you move up the pathway, progressing into college, university programming. On the inside pathway are our organizations. So LSOs down at the regional components, the PSO takes over some of that programming, passes it on to national sport federations, and then obviously international federations for those competitions that are up at the higher end. And then the cool part is the gas pump, because we all know that in order to drive the pathway, I mean, soon it would be electricity, but you know, we might have to change that. We've got gas now. And these are all the multi-sport organizations that contribute to helping to fuel the vehicle across the pathway. So if you didn't like the words, the visual works really well. So how do we measure success? So this is one of the things that the government looks to us to say, okay, well, if you're receiving this funding, how are you reporting back? So the metric that was in the service plan, as many of you know, was percent BC athletes on national team. And that's going to be a metric that we are going to continue to track. As you'll see when we talk about the deliverables, we're going to get even sort of deeper into how we track that. Because one of the things we found in the investment review is that it is not an easy thing for us to get a fully or a good understanding of how to track that. So we'll look at that a little bit later on. But as you can see here, I mean, these are slides that many of you have seen in these meetings where we've identified the IPS sports in the blue, and then we've got the regional high performance sports in the red, and then the non-targeted sports in the green.
Can you go back a second? So I said, when you've got a number of people on the or percent of people on the national teams, but the question is, what if some particular sport is excelling internationally and another one is terrible internationally? So is that a valid assessment by virtue of just saying who's on? If sport A doesn't even make the cut for the Olympics, versus sport B is potentially a medal winner at the Olympics, how are you going to look at that? How are you going to dive down into that, get better information, or are you?
Yeah, so anybody got an answer to that question? Anybody want to respond?
Isn't that a national sport organization issue, that the national sport organization needs to give a better direction? Because it's hard to have people on national team if, like, it's set by their guidelines. And like in BC, like you can only do so much based on their guidelines.
Yeah, so I think that's a good response, where you know the jurisdiction that organizations would have, and as a PSO, they may not have control over the national team. What we may have some control over is our ability to help athletes progress towards national team, which I think is only one part of the picture. It's only one part of the picture. So that's where we are looking at more than just the one deliverable here. So we'll flip forward and look at this measurable, so domestic results.
So Sean has a question.
Yeah,
So,
Sean.
Bruce's question, but will we then be success also be measured on how that national team does? So if we have a percentage and then national team does well.
From a PSO perspective, probably not, because that wouldn't be part of your jurisdiction. In 2 slides, there is one on basically Bruce's question, which is how do we perform, or how do national teams, BC athletes, perform at Olympic and Paralympic Games? That is still something that, you know, is a bit of a sexy statistics when you're talking to people in government or people that are maybe less informed. You know, these big things called the Olympics come around every 4 years, and people get really excited and they want to know, well, how are we doing as Canadians, and how are we maybe doing as BC within that? But we've made that distinction. That's a good one, because I don't think it would be fair to evaluate the PSO based on that NSO performance. So this one on measuring success domestic results, we'll spend a bit more time. This is just basically what we got from the performance or the investment review. So you can see there that our team sports are doing well as far as medals available, 53%, and then 20% of potential medals available to individual sports. I mean, there you just need to think about how many medals, more medals are available to individual sports. 20% is a pretty good score. The other one that we're looking at, this is data that if you've been to these before, we presented on their conversion rate. So we've spent a lot of time within the Canadian Sport Institute going back over those athlete lists and saying, okay, well, if we've actually started tracking athletes from 2008, do we have a good idea on who actually is converting based on those submitted lists? Those are the athletes that you've identified. What we're curious to know is, did they move to a higher level? Did they convert? And what you can see here is that overall, you know, it's around 15%. And one of the challenges within this sort of view of it is there's a ton of variability in this. Okay, so one of the things that we have to look at when we're measuring this stuff is more of a rolling type of average. And that's what we try to do here. So we're capturing sort of 3 years that the list was submitted. So let's just say in 2013, you submitted a list. We're interested in whether the athlete converted to a higher level in 2014, 2015, or 2016. You can see here that 2016 is not on the slide. Therefore, we don't have all the data to determine whether this percentage should go up, because there could still be a few more athletes that 3 years after that list was submitted could have converted. So we're still waiting on that data. So you see a decline here. You'll say, oh, that's really bad, Dave. We're not converting very many athletes because we haven't given it enough time. So in 2014, we'd be looking at 2015, 16, 17. We're looking at a 3-year window in order to determine whether or not the athlete that was identified converted.
Why just 3 years?
Good
Knowing
question.
that the high performance pathway is probably 10 or 12.
Yeah, so we're looking at within the provincial program, and we actually, Brian, we went back and we looked at how long do athletes typically stay on the targeted list? So we analyzed that. Give me a guess, how many years on average across all sports would you stay athletes stay on the list? 2.6. Oh, 2.6 years. So you're right, we wanted to keep enough time. One of the things that we do identify is that at the provincial development level, there is like a 5-year span. Some of the sports look beyond that, but in many of the sports contexts, because of the age bracketing that they have, they may not continue to target. If an athlete is continuing to convert, they end up showing up on that list because they'll move to Canadian Development or they'll move to Canadian Elite. So indeed, many of our athletes that are actually Canadian Elite identified may be on the list for well over 10 years. What would you say? I mean, we don't have data on that, but just anecdotally, we've probably got quite a few of those national team athletes that are doing more than one quad staying on that list for a longer period of time. And then this is the one that I was talking about before, which we track through the Institute, and we do provide this as some evidence of the sector, and it's more nationally because part of our role at CSI is the national support that we have with targeted national training groups here in the province. So we look at the percent of medals won by BC athletes in different Olympic or Paralympic games on the summer and winter side. As I said, Sean, that wouldn't be something that you would be evaluated on, but I think it is a metric that is important. So back to your question, Bruce. It's not just about percent national team. We're trying to expand that out. And these are more of the global kind of measures. These are not the deliverables, but they're more of the benchmarks, I would say. Toby.
Sorry, for the last slide, do you account for the fact that they're from BC, or do they have to be training in BC?
Yeah, so that's where we get into that question around what is a BC athlete. So we recognize that there are athletes that do take advantage of training here in BC that may not necessarily designate BC as their home province.
Or vice versa,
Or vice versa, yeah. Yeah, so we try to track those as well. That's, and that brings up a good point because that's where sometimes we need your help. And that does come through on that percent national team to help identify that. So some management and oversight. So this is really a cool slide. Love this slide. Some of you may not like it, but I think just schematically it speaks to me. Because at the core of this is this triangle here, which was part of the investment review. And I think, via Sport through that process, got a lot of positive feedback around just how are we being measured and what areas are we being measured. Base of the pyramid, organizational readiness, moving up to coaching and officiating, and then sport for life and excellence. With the yellow at the top being LTAD, and LTAD really being the glue that holds all those pieces together. So if we take that excellence triangle, blow it out, and we look at, okay, what kind of support can Canadian Sport Institute provide on the excellence side? And you start at the bottom, the base of the pyramid. The first thing is around the targeting benefits for those athletes. And this is where Amy's going to get into that a little bit more this afternoon for those of you who are staying. We're very fortunate here in BC to actually have a system by where we can actually target athletes and provide them with some benefits. Within the Institute, we have some very strong programming, and we're trying to expand that programming. We're trying to innovate on that programming. And you can see here just some of the programs that we have in this sort of bullet. On the sides, we have our Canadian Sports School, moving Ignite potentially into a licensing opportunity. Amy does a great job with our Sport Performance Speaker Series, so some of you really take advantage of those. Our Advanced Coaching Diploma, we've moved into a sort of institute-wide model across Canada, but we also have a brand new graduate certificate at the University of British Columbia, who some of you are involved in, so that's pretty innovative. We do run our High Performance Coach Advance, thanks to many of you that came to our advance this year with Wade Gilbert. That's good feedback. One of the things that Kurt's really involved in is the RBC Training Ground. So you would have seen some of that through CBC television. And that is a program that's going to continue. And then the other big part of what Kurt's doing is the next gen with the targeted athlete sort of training group, of which some of you are involved in management committees from a PSO perspective. The technical leadership, we're going to be involved in the ongoing investment reviews. One of the things that we're going to do on a consistent basis is run these powering podiums. So to me, it comes back to, can we more efficiently deliver some of the information that we feel is pertinent to high performance sport here in the province? I could go out and I could have individual conversations with many of you, and I actually have. So thank you for those that phone me up and have those individual conversations. Katie, it's a great conversation with you and Judo. But by having these powering podium sessions, maybe we can target group sessions. So we're looking, obviously, this one is really kicking off this whole investment review process, the report 3. This afternoon, we'll revisit the targeting of athletes, because we have to get more efficient in that without having ADA roles within the Institute. The next one we're looking at sometime in November. I'm going to try and put it around sport leadership. Sport leadership is here in Richmond this year, and we're looking at something around high performance pathways. So I've been working very closely with Danny Van Nugent, who's with us at Podium, and he's actually within our UVC program. And they are looking at how that high performance pathway is informed throughout the whole sports system in Canada. So that is to come, and then we'll have other ones as we progress. And those are based on conversations, like Heather said, with the PVCs, or conversations that we can hear within the Institute. We also have some oversight. Oh, you know, you're pushing me. Along with the Pacific Sports Centers, largely a role that Amy plays within the Institute, providing that. Okay. Yeah, you can go. This is this is really identifies the levels that we have that many of you are familiar with. So we do target the athletes, and like I say, the benefit is talking about, it's 3.7 million VIK. So, you know, why do I say 3.7 million VIK? Because it's a bigger number. I mean, really what we're trying to do is get some sort of estimate that the athletes who take advantage of the benefits through the institutes, gym works, food stuff, educational programming, grants, bursaries, all of those things could take advantage of up to $1,000 per athlete. And some of them are more depending on the benefits that they have. So there is a pretty significant VIK, and I think part of that is just having the system within the regional centers as well, where they've actually gone out, developed these partnerships. And just about every day, Amy's telling me about a new partnership that they're bringing in. And the big ones that have a huge difference is if we can get like grocery store partnerships. So Toby nodding his head as a former Olympian and high performance athlete, yes, taking advantage of those. Let's move forward on this one. We're going to have more on that this afternoon.
Now we're going to go into the Enhanced Excellence funding. So we did highlight a few changes that were already made this past year. But we did do a further review to make sure that the program was aligned with all the objectives and the processes of the rest of the investment review. So just to highlight some of those key principles again is transparency, making sure that we're more efficient and streamlined, fair, and merit-based. So those same principles are applied throughout the investment review as well as for the Enhanced Excellence Program funding. So we identified 8 key objectives through this process that we felt that were key indicators of a successful high performance program. And they would identify whether a PSO or DSO is ready to utilize and leverage this extra funding. So those principles were clarity and high performance leadership with a coach or manager overseeing a high performance program, a proven ability to move athletes through the development pathway and achieve results, strong linkages with the NSO, having an established high performance program already in place with strong organizational leadership, a clear strategic plan that identifies performance orientation and connection to operational plans, governance and policies in place to support high performance programming, and the ability to leverage resource capacity to maximize high performance programming. So these were pulled out of the investment review, so they link to certain questions within the excellence and the organizational readiness categories that were evaluated during the investment review process. And I think, Dave, you're going to speak a little bit more to that.
Yeah, I mean, if some of you are sitting there and you're looking at those, you should have this moment of deja vu, all right? Like I've been in this room before. Because if I was sitting here and I'm looking at those are not a lot different than what we were looking at within the IPS and the IPS review meetings. Essentially looking at best practices and organizational readiness. And the next slide, that's the one I was going to pull up. So you can just sort of see there a bit of a shift, and part of it is to sort of get a better picture of how can we actually identify what those results are. So we had in the IPS a much higher weighting towards that results component, where we made probably a more significant shift is moving towards knowing that you have a good system in place. The system, the results will then be a byproduct of that system, and also strong organizational readiness. So eligibility. How do you know that you're eligible to receive enhanced excellence funding? You're going to have to click on, you don't have those. Oh, I did have it. Because you can't read that slide. There's no way, if you're sitting at the back, that you can read that slide. So I put in sort of this and stuff. So the first thing is, you got your report card. On your report card, it should identify whether you're an accredited PSO or not accredited. If you're an accredited PSO, or if you're not accredited, you're not eligible. Okay? First gateway. Click the one more. But many of you in the room are accredited PSOs. Therefore, yes, you then move and you say, is my score, so on that excellent scoring, those 8 objectives that we just identified, so we reweighted those 8 objectives to come up with a score in excellence based on those objectives. And of course, with all these scoring, there's sort of a split or a good demarcation point. So we looked at 60 or above. So if your score is 60 or above, apply. You're eligible. If you're not 60 or above, so maybe you're not 60 or above, you're below that, but you're in tier 3 or 4 sport. So when you got your report card from VIA Sport, you're actually doing pretty well in the sector. If you remember way back, because some of you guys have been studying these reports, that we wanted to value those PSOs that actually are good across the board. So in order to get what we were calling in Report 1 program funding, you had to be a 3 or a 4 tier. So we put that in, and if you are in 3 or 4, yes, you can apply, and if you're not, then you're not eligible, and that will be a reevaluation, and you would wait till the next evaluation. We're going to talk about that in the last slide here. Okay. So I put this slide in. It's really, are you ready to apply? Now, you don't have the report in front of you, so it's not in absolute black and white. Although Dave, some of you are probably, Chris is checking his phone and he's kind of like, okay, yeah, there's my report, and then you're probably doing the calculations, right? No? Where did we put that report? They're probably thinking, yes. The only point that I put here is, from here on, your application, if you're eligible, is more of a commitment towards, can we follow through with the process? And some of you might say, no, we're not ready yet. Not ready. Not going to apply right now. Some of you might say, yeah, absolutely, ready to apply. Okay. So when we move in to application and selection, 4 main components in selection. One is your enhanced excellence weighted score. Based on those 8 objectives that we identified, that Heather identified, what does your score look like there? One filter. Yes?
Do we know what the weighting is for each of those 8 objectives?
Yes.
We have a handout that we can pass out, and it's right directly from the report that shows you a breakdown of each one of the questions.
Okay. There is a prioritization for Olympic or Paralympic sport. Okay, if you are within that Paralympic or Olympic sport, if your sport is part of that, there's a prioritization towards that. Lots of discussion about what may be happening in Tokyo, and the IOC identifying different sports that might come into the Olympic agenda. The third one is the deliverables, and we'll spend some time on those. But are you able to, essentially in this round, report on the deliverables that we're asking from you? And then the last one is just whether or not there are government priorities at the time. We'll get into that in the slide later on. So categorization. So this is the first step. So what category do you fall in? If you're eligible, if you apply, where do I fit? So you'll either meet the criteria, or if you don't meet it, then you've got to wait for your reevaluation. So let's look at it that way. If you don't meet criteria, you have an opportunity when you go through the investment review, reevaluation. If you do meet criteria, we filter on Olympic or Paralympic. If you're not an Olympic or Paralympic sport, we've got the 3 categories across the bottom that come up: evolving, advancing, and leading. You will fall into evolving. And yes, those different categories would have different funding bands attributed to them. So your Olympic or Paralympic sport, your score is above 70, or below 70, that is, so I'll do the no. So if your score is below 70, then you fall into the evolving category. And then if your score is between 70 and 85, on the next click, but not above 85, so you're not greater than 85, then you're in the advancing category. And then, if you're above 85 on that score, you're in the leading category. So that's the first sort of idea, is where do you fit? If you're eligible, which category? And the categories are based on preserving that idea that you have different funding buckets for the different categories. So going into deliverables, there's 4 overall categories that you would be required to report on as deliverables. One is a category around your high performance system. The other one would be coaching benchmarks, athlete benchmarks or athlete measurables, and then performance enhancement. I'll get into those each when we talk about the deliverables, so that'll make it very clear as to, okay, what do we want? Or clearer than what's going through your head right now. On the other side, there is information that we will collect at CSI Pacific that will also help to inform some of the deliverables. One of the things that we are looking at is the verification of on-time submission of a targeted athlete list. And why are we doing that? Because this becomes a human resource issue. We don't want to be in a situation where we have to beg the sport to get the list and then having to expend a lot of time. We're trying to systemize how we do that, and that's what our afternoon session is about. We're also very interested to know whether or not your athletes, if you're actually identifying them as targeted athletes, are they actually registering and taking advantage of the benefits? Talked about conversion rate as an overall, so we would have the data from those athlete lists. We'll do that job. We have a system whereby we can do it, thanks to Drew, and identify how your athletes are converting based on who you've identified. Want to look at nominated coaches? Any coach that you put on your targeted athlete list will be deemed a targeted coach. So we want to know, not for all the coaches in your system, what some of that data is, but for those coaches that you've identified coaching your targeted athletes. And then the last one is the sort of athlete education. So how much do of your targeted athletes are actually engaging in things like the speaker series or athlete advance, those types of events even within the Pacific Sport regions. And then the last one, so those are the 4 areas. So we had 1, 2, we had the categorization, we got the deliverables, and then or Olympic, Paralympic, and then the deliverables, and then this one is the priorities. So one is, we're not sure, we can't predict into the future what the available funding is. And even in the IPS slide, you saw that early on in the IPS, there was actually some more funding that went towards the IPS than later. So we're very fortunate to have around 1.65 million that has been allocated this year. But in the future, we still need to advocate for why that is important funding for our sector. It also may be a governmental focus. So governmental focus at a given time. Elections may impact what happens. Those are realities. So this is the bucket where it's like we may not have total control, but we have the ability to inform. The last one we'll look at is the allocation. This is a very similar process to what we're doing, and then what we'll do is we'll take a bit of a break and then we'll come back and we'll talk about deliverables. So within the allocation, those sports who are selected, so even though you're eligible, you may not get selected, but those sports who are selected may have a review meeting, and I'm saying may have a review meeting at the end of May, because that review meeting is really around checking with you as a PSO on some of the deliverables that you have identified or what your plan might be. And many of you were involved in that this year. The maybe might be that, hey, you could be a sport, everything's great. Do we really need to meet with that sport? Everything's really good? Yeah. That's a question that we might be looking at. Once again, if we're looking at potentially there might be, certainly in the investment review, 41 sports applied to sort of access enhanced excellence money. In a 1-week period, it's hard to have 41 sport meetings. So we have to be efficient on how we do that. If you are invited to the meeting, it's very simple around the gaps or challenges you have. We want to hear about that, the priorities, and a budget. So at this point, everybody would have to submit a budget to show where you're actually spending the money. Different than the last time, so as CSI, we were really helping the sports to engage their NSO and the PSO. We're putting that responsibility, or OTP, we're putting that responsibility back on you. You can see one of the objectives is if you have strong linkages with your NSO, it may be an advantage to have your NSO represented at a meeting if you're invited to that meeting. For some of you, it may be that you can actually lean out and say, is it possible to have our OTP advisor there for some of the targeted sports in the room. And then with all of this, as you know, and it's a challenge that we have, is trying to get the announcement of whether or not that funding is available by December 31st, so that there are plans that either can be rolled over or maintained or new plans started. That's a challenge that we have with this, as opposed to maybe core funding that goes on a more annual cycle that we have, which the next slide speaks to here. Heather?
So what we try to do here is show how the investment review core funding process is, we're trying to align it with the enhanced excellence process. So 2015-16 was our last fiscal year, and all the PSOs and DSOs went through their evaluation as part of the investment review. As well, we had the review process for enhanced excellence funding. And now we're in the 2016-17 cycle. So those of you that are already, some of you are already receiving enhanced excellence funding. We will go through a reapplication this year just for enhanced excellence funding, which will inform funding for 2017-18. So that's starting April 1st, 2017 would be the new cycle of funding. And as Dave said, we'd try to notify you before December 31st, 2016 if you're receiving that funding in starting April 1st, 2017. Yeah.
So when will the application process be?
Yeah, so right now, as you report in through BCSI, that's the start of collecting the deliverables necessary, but the evaluation and review would take place in late November. Yeah.
For the application process, so it's an ongoing thing on BCSI, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so other than expressing that you're wanting to be considered for funding, as long as you are continuing to do your reporting, especially if you're already receiving some funding, if you're doing your reporting, then right now we're collecting the information that we need from you, and then we would go on to the review meeting would be the next step of the process.
I think just to clarify that too, I mean, we'll talk about this in the deliverables when Heather addresses BCSI. But my comment earlier on is, are you ready to apply? And that's where, you know, as you go through and look at all of the deliverables and things like that, you can say, yes, we can do that, and we would apply. Is it a formal application? I mean, I think one of the things we would look at is just informing your PDC of your intention to apply if you're eligible. But what we've done is opened up BCSI so that all the templates are available. But we need to have a sort of clear idea. It's just sort of that gateway of yes, we're committed to this process.
I think the big point to note is in 2018 there will be a full reevaluation of the investment review process and all the scoring, so that those new scores would then reinform the enhanced excellence process. We would redo your enhanced excellence score, which could, if you're not currently eligible, it could mean that you are eligible in the next cycle, or it could mean that you're eligible for a different category of funding. So that 2018-19 will be a big year where we realign funding for 2019 and beyond.
The other thing you'll notice here is just in the audit stage, it's what does an audit mean? Amy was good enough to ask me that question on the ferry as I was coming over. And it's really just a matter of, are you actually achieving or meeting the deliverables as far as submission on time, all of those elements? And because of the limited amount of funding, yes, I mean, there is an opportunity that the Corp would have to look at that and say, okay, well, you're not meeting deliverables, therefore, can we claw back that funding and reallocate it? Okay. Essentially, if you're looking at this, you're kind of saying, geez, if I get it here, the next time, it could be on a 2-year cycle for this year. Okay. Okay, so more. Yeah.
And then the next step to that, then submitting your expression of interest, is reporting against these deliverables that we're speaking to now. So if you're already receiving the funding, or you've already committed to these deliverables and have a deadline within your contribution agreement. If you're new, you should go in and look at these and look at reporting against these so that we have something to have a conversation with you about. Yeah. Okay. So for everyone receiving core funding, you're already asked to report on 2 deliverables: the percentage of athletes on the national team and your domestic results. And then for enhanced excellence funding, there's 4 main categories that we've asked people to report on: their high performance system and tracking of their coach benchmarks, their athlete benchmarks, and their sports science or performance enhancement. And Dave will go into that a bit more.
Just stop you on that one. I think, so some of you will go back to the old IPS and say, okay, well, what did we have to deliver? What were some of the deliverables? And there was a lot of documentation that was shared. And that was really an intimate conversation that many of you would have had with your ADA in sharing that documentation. So things like a YTP, there would be some performance benchmarks, evidence of fitness testing, those types of things. And where we're moving to, and this is the shift that I want to really speak to, is that the deliverable is more data driven. So we're interested in getting some of your data, and I'll say it right now, it's not going to be absolutely perfect this go round as to how we collect that data, because the diversity across the room in how you do that is going to be very, very sport specific. But we're going to try our best to try and capture some of these data points. And a lot of this data can actually infer whether or not you've actually got some of the documentation in place. So hopefully you'll see that as I run through some of the deliverables. If we go back to the core funding deliverables, yes, we want every PSO in the system to be able to report on that. So let's go through them, because I've got, oh no, you were going to do BCSI. Yeah.
So if you go log into BCSI, you'll notice that a new tab has been added. It's an excellence tab, and within the tab there's 2 subcategories. So the results category is where you're going to report those core deliverables, your athletes on your national team and your domestic results. And then in the high performance system is where we're asking you to report all the information related to enhanced excellence funding. And like Dave said, whether you're receiving the funding now or not, you'll see the same thing as everybody else. So you'll have access to the templates and see what those reporting requirements are. So here is what the high performance system page looks like. So mainly it's just a file upload. So there is a first report, a second report, your performance enhancement services or supporting documents, as well as a financial report. And you will find the templates for download available in this box here. And we may have time to show you them as Dave talks a little bit more about them as well. So when you do click on that box, it'll come up with a list of the documents that are available for you to download.
And those are Excel files, right?
Yeah.
And then you put them in and you upload them. But I think this slide, just to move on to this one, is that this is one of the challenges that we have. What is a BC athlete? You know, and we've had to create some definition around this, because we recognize that not only there are BC athletes that you've had a big stake in developing through your PSO programming. So let's say they've been involved in secondary schools here in the province and they've been involved in a provincial program. That would be considered a BC athlete. They may actually go and train in a centralized program out of the province. Speed skating does that. As soon as you get to a certain level, you move to Calgary. But they can still qualify as a BC-based athlete. The other one, as we look at, is because of the significant training that athletes may do in BC. So we have a lot of national training groups here, and those athletes are spending a significant amount of time in the province, supported largely by some of the resources that we have. So we need to count those athletes as well. So that's where this is greater than 3 months in the province. Board development has significant, that word developed is really around your state in developing those athletes. Were they involved in your provincial program? So if we look at just the equation, pretty simple math here. The numerator is the BC athletes. When I go out and ask PSOs, I can get that answer, no problem. Many of you, all of you know who your BC-based athletes are and whether they're on the national team. Where we get a little bit of an unknown is, what is the size of your national team? Is your national team the A team? Is it the B team? Is it the C team? D, E, F, G in some cases? And that's where there's a determination between senior, development, and junior teams. And we need your help to help verify some of that stuff. Certainly, we've gone back to the NSO on occasion and looked at, okay, what is the national team? We had a great conversation coming over on the ferry to really look at, okay, what is considered national team? So if we go to the second layer, probably one of the best ways to look at this is BC athletes named and competed on a national team, and they could be read sanctioned national team at an international event. So, give you some perspective, I work with Taekwondo Canada. They have open championships all over the world. BC athletes go and compete in those open championships. They compete in the US Open, they compete in the Dutch Open, they compete in those open championships. That's great. That is not a national team. Taekwondo Canada does not fund or support those athletes in any way to those events. Those are not national team athletes. So they have to be athletes that are named by your NSO to one of those sanctioned events. Now, where Taekwondo does go is they'll go to Pan American Games. And in that situation, they will send a senior team and they will send a junior team. They will fund coaches, they will fund the athletes to go to those events. In their Sport Canada agreement, they would probably get some money from the court funding through Sport Canada to fund those types of events. So that's where you've got to zero in on that.
I have a question.
Yes.
We have 3 kids on our provincial team that are carded by Alpine Canada, even though they're on our team, but they're being funded through Alpine Canada's carding system. Do we include those people or not by virtue of their international ranking? They're top 15 in the world for their age. So because the ski team can't accommodate them all because of financial restrictions, we're looking after them, but they're funded by Alpine or by Sport Canada.
Yeah.
Would those people be included as well?
Later on, you've got like this sort of vision of where the next slides go, right? But we would need your help, Bruce, because I would say in that situation, those are your athletes. They're not necessarily named to the national senior ski team.
Correct, but they're funded through Sport Canada. I mean, I'm
So
just curious.
in that case, I wouldn't count them as national team athletes.
Okay.
Okay. Now you may count them as, you could maybe count them as development team athletes,
Okay,
right?
that's fine. Yeah.
But didn't you say on the one before, if they're funded to go to these sanctioned international events, which they would be, right? Your ski guys?
Pardon me?
Oh,
My ski guys, sorry, I missed the question.
well, are they funded? I mean, that's the way I understood that other. I mean, if you're not on, you can only name so many to national team, but you may have a big one. But carded athletes, but it says if they're sent to
Yeah.
sanctioned international events by Canada or Alpine.
No, we would pay for them, but they do, but they're carded through.
But
Sport
if
Canada.
if the NSO was paying, then they are.
You can count
Okay.
that, yes, yes. Kate?
My question was about the funding, because sometimes we have athletes that will be selected by the NSO to
Yeah.
attend the international events. You can't go unless you're selected, but they're only partially funded, or sometimes they have to self-fund.
And that's the challenge, right? Remember what we said about the diversity?
Yeah.
Like this is, intuitively, this is a very simple stat to get. But when you get into the complexity of it, it becomes quite hard. You know, so in your case, like, you're the sport that has A, B, C, D, E,
But it's
F,
only
G,
the top four that
right?
count as senior.
So
Yeah.
A, B, C, D is senior, more than likely there will be funding. That becomes
But they
very
only fund A and
easy.
B usually, right?
Yeah, so that's where the decision has to be, okay, what is the best representation of what that senior national team is? Because we have this issue with wrestling. You know, do they count A and B, or do they just count B? Because right now, on their A team, there's 4 people on the A team in men. There's 4 BC athletes. That's a huge percentage, right? They don't want to count B because that'll affect their percentage on the national team. But then what we don't want is we don't want them coming around next year and saying, oh, hang on a second, we're going to count B. Because now we've got 3 more athletes on B. All we need to do is get to a system. That's why I said this isn't pretty, this isn't perfect. In this situation, the couple of people in the room might be just, you know, freaking out like Dean in rugby, because national team events happen all throughout the calendar cycle. These would be sanctioned events. Currently, Rugby Canada is playing a test event, so 3 series, I think, Dean. So I'm not necessarily interested in Dean identifying each game, of which we know there's only 22 athletes that are selected to go on the field. I'd be more interested in knowing in the series. More than likely, sport I know a bit well, probably usually about 30 people get selected to a series. And out of that, there may be 15 to 20 BC athletes. Okay? So this becomes a pretty accurate way of looking through an event window, and when you get to the templates, you can see that you can look at how you can track this through the template. We do have a bit of time, we can show the template. The second one is a little bit more announcement driven. So in some of your sports will make a formal announcement at a certain time of year who's on the national team, who's on the national development team, or who's on a national junior team. And then what's really good about that is they kind of put the pictures up, and then you can somewhat verify that. The challenge is, and our friends from field hockey back there, because it always changes, right? They announce it, and then 2 weeks later, it changes. So that becomes a bit of a challenge, right? We've had that challenge before when we're looking at that. But in that case, it would be, all right, Bruce's situation, they actually do name that national senior team. So it's pretty static. This is how many people were named to that team this year. You can determine what BC athletes. And then the last one would be really just looking at your Sport Canada cards. I mean, and if we were to do it probably straight across the board, we could do based on Sport Canada card, just basically saying, okay, we don't even need to talk to you guys, because we know, we get the Sport Canada carding list, we know how many are on there, and then we can tell how many are BC athletes. That's not fair to you, because we know that there are many athletes who do compete on national teams that don't get carded. So we brought that in as another layer that you could use to identify the size of that national team. Once again, it's very sport specific. I mean, is a D level card a development athlete, or do some of those D level athletes actually compete at a senior level? Okay. Yeah, Chris.
A weird question, but what's the average age of PSO athletes, high performance athletes?
Average age?
17?
Yeah, it's about 17.9. So we've looked at over the targeted athlete list. It's one that I'll bring up this afternoon. But I was curious about that because when do athletes cease to be targeted? Grade 12.
Okay. What's the average age of the athletes on the national team?
Don't know.
It's also going to vary quite drastically from sport to sport.
Well, that's the point though.
Yeah.
There's some sports where at 17 they're on the national team. In other sports, you've got to go through 5 years of university and then go on, and you're in your late 20s. And we're using that as a measure when they've been out of our system for a long period of time.
Yep,
So it's really, like, I know you're trying to create one
yep.
metric, but it's really hard when
That's
they're
why-
so different.
And then the answer to that question, so you remember back to some of those slides that we had, and we looked at how much contribution does results have to the performance score. In the old IPS, we put 40%. But through the investment review process and the challenges that we have exactly for this one, is that it's still a stat that the government has on their service plan. It's still a stat that we produce to the government. Is it the best representation in a team sport like yours? It's a challenge because the gap between your programming and national team is huge. In other sports, it's not. The challenge when it comes to you guys is how do you develop programming to help support those athletes a little bit further along the pathway? Or identifying that strong based fundamental programming that did help support those athletes that eventually did get to the national team. But they may have had to spend 3 or 4 years at a university, college, or some other element. So yeah, very philosophical kind of look at it, but it's only one metric that we're trying to look at, okay? That's all I really can say about it. Great questions.
Do you want to pull the template now?
Yeah, let's look at that. Yeah, it's. So in the template here, it's just looking at, this is the instructions page, so it just gives you the instructions here, and what you're going to have to do is look at team sport, individual sport, and then there's quasi-individual sports, okay? The dynamics of it. So if you're a team sport, then you're looking at identifying the different events that you may have that are national events. So this is the challenge we use to say rugby example here, where they may have a series of 10 international events that are national teams go to. And then we're able to calculate based on that. And I think down below is the individual one. Click. Okay, so domestic results. So this one is coming a little bit closer to home for many of you. So how do we perform in our national events? First determination, are you an individual sport, team sport, or in this sort of category of quasi-team sport? So this is where it gets a bit challenging because we recognize that some sports do compete as teams in events, but there are a lot of disciplines within that sport. So for instance, in badminton, you could call, well, you're in Toby a team event because you're in mixed doubles, but we would consider you as an individual sport. Right? Then you look at the events. So how do you know which events to track? So when we did the investment review, it was like, here are all the events that we participated in at a national championship level. Masters, athletes, down to U10 Little League baseball. So very well informed that we know the scope of that pathway, but what we're trying to do is narrow it in to the criteria that you use to identify your targeted athlete list. So if you have a provincial development 2 or provincial development 1, in your targeted athlete list, you would have criteria that would speak predominantly to events. So one of the events that we would have is participation selected to Canada Games. Many of you would have that as a criteria for provincial development 2. Okay, so that's part of the cleanest example. Some of you may have examples of different age grade national championships, but that's the depth of your list. That's what we're interested in you delimiting this. So we don't want to know all the information. We You want to know the information that's aligned to your targeted athlete list. And then the last piece is medals that you're able to achieve in those championships. And this goes back to some of the questions that were asked in the investment review. So this is an example of individual or quasi-individual sport. So national championships, so you might have identified, say, a U18 or age group nationals. I'll get into an example. Katie, if I could use your example, because it's so good to have here, is judo, 10 weight categories? 14, okay. I was short on a couple. Okay, 14 weight categories?
I'm counting both male and female.
Yeah, so,
Which are different.
yeah, so 7 and 7, so you would have to count female and male separately.
Okay.
And we also have a column for co-ed, which counts other sports like badminton there. But then you look at, okay, number of events. So in that event for nationals, for that category, you may have on the men's side 6 weight categories that you're competing in, right? So we're only going to count the ones that you actually send athletes to compete in. Okay, so it's then, so if you add 6, then the calculation is, well, what are the total number of medals available in those categories? And this is where it even gets tricky for some sports. Because I would bet that most of you would say, well, you sent 6, usually there's first, second, third are the medals, so 6 times 3 is 18. In some sports, though, they give out 2 bronze medals. So it could be that you're in a sport that has 4 medal opportunities instead of 3. So that's where you need to do your calculation to say, okay, what was the total number of medals available in the sport? And then, how many did we win? So they sent 6 in the female category. They've got 24 medals. Do you have 4? 4. Yeah. And they medaled in 3 of them. Okay? Is that a good example? On that?
In the system, are you also looking at how many categories BC is not competing in? Because that's indicative of how fulsome the program is.
Yeah. So whether a
So does
sport
that
is
come in the
unable
system?
to compete at a certain level,
Yeah.
that would be indicative. I mean, the feedback, Marilyn, that we got is that this is some of the stuff through the investment review is it's a score that they're going to get in their investment review. So we want to give them that opportunity. So rather than saying, we want to know what you're doing strategically well, and I think that that's just another side. Certainly one to keep our eyes open to. So what is it?
Dave,
Yeah.
question for you, sorry. Just, if you've got 2 athletes in 2 categories,
Yeah.
in spite of the fact that there's 3 medals per category, if you've only got 2 athletes, realistically, total number of medals available is 2. They can't
Yeah,
really
they
win
can't win.
gold, silver, and bronze.
But everybody's being looked at in that same window,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, so we recognize that that is one of maybe the flaws, that you can't actually, if I sent 3 athletes, then potentially I could get all 3 medals.
Sure.
And that could be an advantage that you have.
Yeah, in which case, okay,
Yeah.
so they got first, second, third, they got 3 out of
Yeah.
3, they got 100% was their medal count.
Yeah, yeah,
But if there's the -1 rule, right, which generally if you come last, you don't get a medal. You know, there's only 3, I don't know, most sports I know, they have a rule that there's only 3 people you only give out gold and silver, you don't give out bronze, right?
yeah, though in the weight category sports, they do that.
Yeah,
Because
so then we can
sometimes-
count there was only 2
Yeah.
medals available because it was only
Right,
3
exactly,
winners.
so you can make that adjustment. But you're right, I mean, that is potentially a flaw in that system, right? Okay. I don't have an answer to how to look at that, other than that we're trying to look at it, everybody consistent. Yes, if you were able to send more athletes, then the potential is that you could potentially have more medal opportunities.
There are sports, though, that where the number of entries you can put into an event are limited, correct?
There could be based on quotas, quota spots.
Well, can you only enter one badminton team in the senior men's category?
I don't know, can you only enter one badminton team in the senior men's, or can you take multiple teams to national championships?
It's actually open to anybody, which is, can kind of also see the numbers, because like the people who want to go just to see their friends and have a party than those tournaments to show. I mean, that's reality of it.
That was the point where you had to say, no.
Pretty good idea.
I didn't gotta have the chat.
Why I love having the coaches in the room to get that reality check. Team sports, I mean, this is where we're looking at the, you know, do you have more than one team competing? So an example might be, let's say, joining in softball. You may send 3 or 4 teams to a national age group championship. And of course, that would be dependent on the targeted athlete list, right? So we would identify. So what we recognize in team sports like softball is that there may be more opportunity for those younger ages, which you may actually not report on because it may not be part of your list criteria. But in some cases, we do send maybe 2 teams in an age category. I know rugby does this, and field hockey does this, into nationals, and then the number of top 3 placings, and then this should be just number of 4th and 5th placings, but it's really top 5. Okay, can be placed 4th or 5th. And then the way that that gets calculated out in your scoring helps to look at a score of 1 versus 2 versus 3 versus 4. Okay. So those are examples of.
But in Canada Games, we're limited to the number of athletes you can put in an event.
Yeah, but that could only, and that only comes up every 4 years, right?
Yeah.
So in some years, you may not even be putting that down. But we do want to get a picture of what does that look like. I mean, we have a good idea of what that looks like based on, you know, having Jared in the room. They do a very, very good job of tracking a lot of that information as well. So under the high performance program information, the easiest one is how many targeted athletes do you have? You will submit a list, CSI Pacific, you will go back to that list, you will count up provincial development 1, provincial development 2, male, female, and you would submit those numbers. Okay, that's easy. If you don't have a list, you're going to stay this afternoon, you're going to figure out how to get it. The next one is around the early training plan. So we're not going to ask you for YTPs. I love looking at Blake's YTP because he's in the diploma program. But I'm not going to look at 64 YTPs, and in some cases, multiple YTPs because some of that programming is being directed by personal coaches or other things. So can we get some information based on a YTP that you should have at your fingertips? So, in discussion with many of the sports, how many of you actually have a generalized YTP for your provincial program? Probably every sport does. And what we want to know is, based on your targeted athlete list, so let's say I've put 20 athletes on my targeted list. Are all those athletes under a generalized provincial YTP? I would say, Dean, in your case, you could probably say, yeah, you know what, Dave, they're all those provincial development 1, provincial development 2. I could count all 40 of my athletes under that. Then you may look at, okay, at what point does that get individualized? So do you have some type of microcycle training plan that's individualized? Or S&C that you've identified? So at what point is that individualized and it's PSO directed? Okay, so you've got a provincial person running that program that identifies individually that they know what's going on with that athlete on a weekly basis. The reality is, in some sports, it could be 100% of your athletes are here, 20% of your athletes are here. And that may depend on the depth of targeting that you have. Okay, so if you're looking at lower age groups, I mean, you may not have some of that depth. The diversity of people that are in the room and the type of planning that we're doing. Club and personal coach directed YTP. So many sports, that is the responsibility of a personal coach and not necessarily a provincial program. That one is a tough one, because if you don't have a relationship with those coaches where you can actually determine what that is, then it becomes a tough probability to get that. Is this a perfect status? Think about it this morning. Let's say if you're multiple disciplines, I mean, this is unbelievably difficult to track. I mean, is it around sort of what a typical athlete would be training? So why? Why are we asking for this information? What does this help us determine? Love the long silent pauses. Because you know I'm probably going to tell you, and that's why you're not putting your hand up. Shannon? Why? One is, we're not looking at a YTP, but this could inform that if you actually have a YTP, you can actually get some of this information. And there's a question later on that actually informs that too. Secondly, is we want to get a sense, I think, of the volume of training that's happening within the PSO versus what may be happening in the club. I know in rugby, it would be almost impossible to report on this number here, personal club coach directed, but yes, in some of the training, it may be that there's a certain number of training days or athletes that are being supported through those training plans. And we'll see it come up later on. So with coaches, like I said, by virtue of putting a coach, so on your targeted athlete list, you have primary or secondary coach. You can name 2 coaches. By virtue of identifying an athlete, you can identify a coach who will work with that athlete. And I've been working with some of the PSOs on how we can maybe expand or look at that sort of coach depth chart. Because one of the things that we can do is we can help to incentivize those coaches to be part of your system to help develop those athletes. So it may be that you identify 20 athletes and that there's 10 coaches that you've identified who work closely with those athletes. Out of those 10 coaches, that's your number there. I got 10. Are we paying for any of those coaches? So are those PSO paid full-time coaches? Full-time or part-time coaches? Might have 1, I might have 2. Out of the 10, I might have my provincial head coach, or I might have my assistant coach, for example. So you might have 2. You might have more that actually receive honorary or expenses. In fact, that could be all 10. If your coaches are coming out and helping you in camp settings or things like that, you're providing some funding to those coaches, so you might say 10. Then going into the locker, out of those 10 coaches, what are their NCCB qualifications? Are they level 3 or CompSat Dev certified? Very simple check on the locker, or if you run your locker report, you can just come up with that information. Okay, out of those coaches. So you might have 4 of those coaches that meet that. Pro coach designation, so another thing on the locker now, under professional coaching. So you can have chartered professional coach status or a registered coach. Many of the PSOs use this as a risk management tool to suggest that, yes, it's important that we have professional standards for our coaches and that we are requiring them to register with a professional organization, with the Coaching Association of Canada. That allows them to have a criminal record check. It allows them to verify that, but also verify the code of conduct as well. Every coach that we put through our advanced coaching diploma has to be a member or has to be registered. And then engaging in PD. So out of those 10 coaches, are they engaging in PD? You can do that by looking at the locker, or if you don't have those numbers, you might be tracking PD for for those coaches. That's up to you how you might look at that. So with athletes, to limit this down to your development 1 and development 2 athletes, as we'll talk about this afternoon, this comes back to your annual training plan. This is where it gets a little bit of a challenge, I would say, and that's where you're looking at more of a typical. So Garrett, this is going to be a challenge in athletics because you have so many disciplines. You know, how do you kind of peg down what you have? But we're focusing on just the athletes on your targeted list. Do you have a sense of the number of training days that they're involved in? Do you have a sense of the number of that are PSO directed, club or personal coach directed, and S&C directed? So in the investment review, that came through that many of you are providing strength and conditioning to some of those athletes. Okay. And then what about the number of competition days? So that is looking at PSO directed competition days. So in the template you'll see, okay, well we actually formally go and compete in this many competitions. So a competition day for Dean might be that they go to national championships, and national championships is played over 4 days, and they might compete in 6 games. That's 4 days of competition, not 6, 4. Okay. How many of your athletes achieve performance benchmarks? So this is where on your targeted athlete list, do you identify benchmarks for those athletes? That was a key component of the IPS. Did the athletes actually achieve the benchmarks? Okay, or a standard that you had for that athlete. That's going to be very personal on how you manage that. In each of these categories, there is a notes section. You can comment on notes. And you might actually, some of you might leave that blank and say, got no idea because I don't know what my benchmarks are. And you might just note that. Okay? An example might be benchmark for rugby. Yes, we're going to achieve a certain performance standard at national championships. Did those athletes achieve those standards? Number of athletes that were involved in some type of functional movement screening, so that's another piece of the IPS that we did look at. And obviously fitness testing, so I would think most of you, 100% of your athletes are involved in some type of fitness testing. So this while it doesn't measure that you have a YTP, some of these numbers can inform that. And then we can actually start looking at what is the volume of training that actually is occurring in a PSO? What is the volume of training that occurs in personal coaching? And the last one, sports science, sport medicine. So on that athlete list, you got 20. Were any of them involved in any sort of concussion management workshop? And then the question comes, well, Dave, there's no concussion in my sport. I can't report on that. Well, that's an NA, and you can write a note to explain why. Okay. The other one you'll see here is, do they need it on a yearly basis for concussion education? And what we're trying to do is understand that a little bit better. So this could help us to inform some system decisions around that. On the WADA side, so anti-doping education, that is a recommendation that we would want to see that does happen every year. Why? Because the WADA code changes every year. And if you happen to be Russian, good chance that you should have gone through that education before you took the drug prior to the first event after the new WADA code came out, which was the Melbourne or the Australian Open. And the tennis player gets in trouble. So we do offer a number of those through our speaker series, but you can actually, many of you can access it through other means as well, and you do that. Great job for doing that. And then individual external strength and conditioning. So how many of your athletes are aligned with some type of strength and conditioning specialist? In the future, we may look at mental training, nutrition, those types of things. Okay. Out of the investment review, probably the predominant sort of performance enhancement that many of the PSOs were engaging on a more exclusive basis was around strength and conditioning. Many of you were using mental performance. It may have been more on a group basis or that type of thing, not individualized. So this is individualized back to your targeted athlete list.
Have a few
And
minutes
that's
for questions.
the last round. That's where we're done. Presenting some of this
Competition
information.
days, you referenced only national championships in your slide there. But in athletics, it's more than just 4 days of competition in the life of the athlete in a year.
Yeah. And that's where you would have to look at those targeted athletes. That's where I think in that context that you have within athletics. And for example, Brian, it's the individual coach that would be making those decisions on those competitions that are the athletes going towards. I think I'll clarify it in the days, but try to maybe put more clarity around PSO, sort of funded or sanctioned events for those targeted athletes.
Would that give you a good, that's not going to give you the volume of
I
competition.
wouldn't give you the total
No.
volume of competitions. I mean, ideally, that's what we want to know is, in a perfect world, those athletes that you've got on your targeted list, do you have a good idea of what their training volume is throughout the year? Do you have a very good idea of what their competition volume is? It may be that you're only able to sample a few of those athletes because you may not know on some of the other ones.
And it'll vary from event to event.
Absolutely.
So all the things that you had to prepare before, with all the lists, still has to do that, but the only thing he has to really send a report is all those questions.
Now, will we look at that stuff? Remember the allocation meeting?
Yes.
That's a good opportunity where we might say, hey, I want to look at that. I want to have a look at that. How do you do that? Is that a best practice, for example?
So we just continue on, but now just report here. He doesn't
Yeah.
have to go through the ADA and all these.
Yeah.
But, so just report what.
Yeah. And I know he's got that information.
Yeah, he's already
He's
done.
got
He just has to transfer it
drilled
into this.
down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But now he just has to transfer the
Exactly.
numbers.
Now, where you may have some of your problems in there is, what about your athletes on the lower mainland where do you have the same targeting of those athletes? Do you have the same sort of confidence in their annual training? Then I think
Well, we were getting there, I just talked to you about changes
Yeah.
and substantial changes on this side.
Great.
Okay, thank you.
Good. Amy, what time do we start back this afternoon, Heather? 1 o'clock. Okay, so for those who are staying this afternoon, we'll see you back here at 1 o'clock. For those who are, thank you very much for taking your time. If you do have questions, you can contact your PVC, go to your PVC. Some of you that know me really well, yeah, contact me.